Okay, so like when you really think about it, what makes you you? Is it just all the thinking and remembering stuff? Or there's something more to it, something about like actually being in a body and how that feels, you know?
Yeah.
It seems like for so long, people doing philosophy mostly focused on reason and stuff.
Hmm.
Sometimes like it was better to just forget about the body and all its well, messiness. But what if we actually put the body front and center? Like really explore how our physical existence shapes who we are, how we see the world. I mean, that's a pretty huge question, right?
No, for sure. It's like a question that gets at the heart of a lot of what philosophy tries to figure out. And I bet with your background, you're already thinking about how this like messes with all those old ideas about mind and body being separate,
Right.
or reason versus emotion. And of course, how all of that got tangled up with ideas about male and female. And feminist philosophy really takes all this head on. It's a way to look at those assumptions, those old ways of thinking, and see just how much the body matters when it comes to figuring out who we are.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we really dug into this awesome resource, this Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on feminist perspectives on the body. But don't worry, this isn't just going to be like a boring summary or anything. It's more like, well, a guided tour made just for a philosopher like you. We're going to break down the main argument, show you all the different ways feminist philosophy tackles the body, everything from how it's shaped by society to what it actually feels like to live in one, and of course, everything in between. The goal here is to get to the good stuff, the really key insights, without like overwhelming you with a ton of details. So where should we even start with all this? One thing that struck me was how, like in some of those early feminist writings, there was almost like a suspicion of the body.
Yeah, you're picking up on something important there. See, those early Western feminists were working in a time when women were basically defined by their bodies. People acted like they weren't as rational as men. So it kind of makes sense that they might be a little hesitant about the whole body thing. I mean, their strategy was often to focus on women's ability to reason, like that famous line from Francois Pouin de la Barre back in 1673, "The mind has no sex." Think about people like Mary Wollstonecraft or John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill. For them, reason was something everyone had, something that shouldn't be limited just because you're a woman. So, from a philosophical perspective, it's super important to see how these thinkers were fighting to show that women could be just as logical and rational as men.
Yeah, that makes total sense given what was going on back then. They were
Yeah.
basically taking on this whole idea that being female automatically meant you weren't good at thinking.
Hmm.
But it wasn't just some abstract intellectual argument, right? I mean, there were some very real, very material things going on with women's bodies at that time.
Oh, absolutely. You see, for middle-class women back in the 18th and 19th centuries, their bodies were almost like products, things to be bought and sold on the marriage market. And Wollstonecraft really nailed it when she pointed out how much of women's lives were spent, like, getting all dolled up and stuff just to attract a husband who could take care of them. This whole focus on the body as something to be judged and evaluated. Wollstonecraft went after that hard in. A vindication of the rights of women, she saw it as this way of disciplining women's bodies, and it held them back, physically and intellectually.
Like, it's just so disturbing, those stories about things like Chinese foot binding. It's just like a really extreme example of how people would literally try to control and constrain women's bodies. And beyond all these social pressures, there was the fact that being female meant being more, well, vulnerable, things that could actually get in the way of their intellectual work, right?
Exactly. Think about it getting sick, which both Mill and Taylor Mill dealt with. That could totally derail their philosophical projects. And then there was the whole constant reality of pregnancy and childbirth. That kind of put a damper on any carefree celebration of female sexuality. So yeah, the body could definitely seem like this huge obstacle to the intellectual life they were trying to lead.
But it wasn't just about feeling wary of the body or seeing it as something that made you vulnerable. There were also early feminist movements that took on this whole issue of bodily rights head on. The Josephine Butler campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act is a great example of that.
Yeah, that was a total turning point. What Butler did was take this classic liberal idea about individual rights and apply it to something super concrete. The right to control your own body, the fact that women were being forced to have medical exams under that act, that was seen as this huge violation. Like, men and doctors were just claiming ownership of women's bodies. And that campaign, it laid the groundwork for so much that came later in feminism, everything from fighting against rape and sexual violence to demanding access to contraception and abortion. And of course, the whole feminist health movement. It all comes back to that basic right to control your own body.
And it's so heartbreaking when you think about the contrast with what enslaved women were going through at that time. Their bodies weren't just seen as vulnerable, they were literally considered property.
Yeah, it was like a completely different reality, tragically so.
As Cheryl Wall really lays out, enslaved women's bodies were used for whatever the slave owners wanted. They were forced to do hard labor to raise their enslavers' children, and they were routinely sexually abused. And their ability to have children, that was just seen as another way to make money. Their bodies were disciplined and controlled in ways that Wollstonecraft, even with her powerful criticisms, probably couldn't have imagined.
And when you think about it like that, Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman? Speech takes on this whole new meaning. The way she talked about her own strength, it directly challenged the image that people had of what a woman was supposed to be like, which was often this weak, delicate thing. Totally. Just Truth being there, her physical presence and the power in her voice, it showed just how important it was to consider race and class when you're talking about embodied experience. She was like this living contradiction to all those ideas about women being frail and needing to be protected. And Cady Stanton also saw how the prejudice against Black people and the prejudice against women were connected. She pointed out how people used physical differences to justify treating both groups as inferior. It's a really important piece of the puzzle when you're trying to understand all the different things going on here.
It's kind of shocking when you realize how long it took for those different experiences, those intersecting identities, to really become central to feminist thought. Even in the early 20th century, when the focus was on things like reproductive rights, which were super important, it still seemed like the body was often treated as something separate from the self, something you owned and could control.
Yeah, you're right. There was still this underlying idea that mind and body were separate. But that same period also brought a big shift thanks to psychoanalysis. Freud and his idea of the bodily ego, this idea that the way we think about ourselves is tied to our awareness of our body, to how different parts of it feel and what they mean to us. That became super important for feminist philosophers later on. It meant moving away from seeing the body as just a bunch of organs or something that's just there to be used. So, for a philosopher, this is a key moment where the whole idea of the self and its relationship to the physical starts to change.
So it's not like the self is just inside the body,
Yeah.
right? It's more like the self is made up of the body. That's a big difference. And that leads us to Simone de Beauvoir, who really put the body right at the center of feminist thought.
Exactly. Her book, The Second Sex, it was like a total game changer for how feminists thought about the body. She was influenced by phenomenology, which is this approach in philosophy that's all about studying consciousness and experience. People like Merleau-Ponty and Sartre were big proponents of this, and Beauvoir used this approach to argue that we can't understand who we are without considering our bodies. For phenomenologists, the self isn't this separate thing that exists apart from the body. It's actually created by the body. It's both a physical thing in the world and, as Beauvoir put it, a point of view towards the world. So if you're coming at this from a philosophical angle, the key here is to see how the body becomes the very foundation of our experience.
And this idea of the lived body, right? The body not just as this objective biological thing, but as something we directly experience with all the feelings and movements and intentions. That was super central to how she looked at things.
For sure. Right at the beginning of The Second Sex, Beauvoir goes into all this detail about the data of biology. But then she immediately warns against what she calls biological determinism. This idea that our biology, like our genes and stuff, totally dictates our destiny. She's saying, look, there might be biological differences between men and women as organisms. She even addresses the argument that women are physically weaker. But those facts by themselves don't really mean anything. It's society that decides how those differences are interpreted and experienced. Like, take the ability to have children. She says it's society that decides what that means and how it's experienced, not biology alone.
So it sounds like she's laying the foundation for this whole sex versus gender distinction that became so important later on in feminism, sex being like the biological stuff and gender being the social and cultural interpretations of that. And her famous line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." A lot of people see that as like the starting point for this whole way of thinking.
You're right. That quote gets used a lot to talk about the sex-gender distinction. But if you want to really get what Beauvoir was saying, you got to understand that her position was more complex than just this simple binary. She knew that even how we talk about biological facts, is influenced by cultural stuff, myths, metaphors, the stories we tell ourselves. Like, think about the traditional way of describing sperm as active and the egg as passive. She totally critiques that narrative, showing how it's based on cultural assumptions, not just biology. And she was aware of how diverse biology can be, pointing out stuff like different ways of reproducing and the existence of intersex people. All of that shows that the biology of sex isn't as simple or clear-cut as we might think. For Beauvoir, sex wasn't just a biological category, it was an existential one, something deeply connected to lived experience.
So for her, becoming a woman wasn't just about internalizing all these expectations from society.
Yeah.
It was also about navigating and experiencing life in a body that biology gave you, but always through this lens of how culture interprets those things. And she really goes into the specifics of what that's like at different points in a woman's life, right?
Yeah, she does this really detailed phenomenology of living the female body. She looks at everything from childhood to puberty, adulthood, and motherhood. And she describes how girls are often raised differently than boys, how they're encouraged to develop different bodily habits. Boys are pushed to be active and explore and assert themselves physically, while girls are often treated more like delicate objects, almost like dolls. Beauvoir thought this led to what she called inhibited intentionality. Basically, girls start to hold back, they're less spontaneous in their movements, less physically assertive, kind of timid in how they interact with the world.
And her descriptions of puberty, menstruation, and motherhood, those have definitely caused a lot of debate among feminists over the years, haven't they? Like her description of pregnant women as being kind of trapped by nature is a pretty striking image.
Yeah, those parts of her work have definitely gotten some pushback, especially from feminists who are trying to reclaim and celebrate those aspects of female embodiment. But remember, Beauvoir was mainly describing how things were experienced in a particular time and place, mid 20th century Western society. She wasn't trying to say that those experiences are universal or that they're inherent to being female. She even said that any limitations women face because of their biology are mostly due to their general situation in society. And that situation, that whole web of social and cultural constraints, that's what she wanted to analyze and ultimately change.
And a really important part of that situation for Beauvoir was this constant awareness of being looked at, of living under the gaze of others.
Exactly. She argued that women, from a very young age, internalize how people look at them and judge their bodies. It's like they're always aware of this external gaze, and it starts to define how they see themselves. It's not their biology that makes them feel this way. It's all the messages they get from society through compliments, criticisms, how women are portrayed in media, all sorts of things. This makes them experience their bodies as objects, which was a super influential idea. Thinkers like Sandra Lee Bartke and Iris Marion Young built on this concept of objectification in their own work.
And that idea of the gaze also had a big impact on how philosophers started thinking about race and embodiment, right? Like Fanon's analysis in Black Skin, White Masks comes to mind.
Absolutely. Fanon, drawing on phenomenology, talked about his own experience of realizing he was black, of suddenly being aware of how white people looked at him and treated him differently when he moved to France. It's definitely connected to Beauvoir's analysis of how women are objectified, but later thinkers, like Shannon Gines, have pointed out that Beauvoir didn't fully account for how race and gender intersect and shape how people experience their bodies.
So even though Beauvoir was a pioneer in bringing in the body into feminist thought, later generations of thinkers pushed back on some of her ideas and added to them, especially when it came to all the complexities of difference. And that brings us to theories of sexual difference.
Right. So unlike Beauvoir, who often focused on how women were seen as other compared to men, theories of sexual difference were all about celebrating and valuing female embodiment. This happened in a few different ways, especially within radical feminism and some types of psychoanalytic feminism. The main goal was to affirm that there were positive and powerful aspects of being female, things that were unique to women, and to transform what were once seen as weaknesses into strengths.
And what were some of the big ideas that came out of radical feminism in this context?
Well, radical feminists, especially in the late 70s and 80s, really emphasized that men and women were fundamentally different. They celebrated things that were seen as specifically female, like female sexuality and the ability to give birth. People like Adrienne Rich wrote about the power of female sexuality outside of patriarchal structures and the importance of maternal bodies. Others, like Sarah Reddick, focused on things like caring for others and developing deep, interconnected relationships, which are often associated with motherhood. Some even connected women's role in reproduction to a natural inclination towards peace and environmentalism, arguing that women should be leaders in those movements.
So they were really trying to reclaim and value things about female embodiment that had been ignored, criticized, or seen as limitations. But this approach also had some problems, right?
Yeah, definitely. While it gave women this strong sense of shared identity and pride in their bodies, it also got criticized for maybe oversimplifying things. Like, it didn't always account for the huge diversity of experiences among women of different races, classes, sexualities, and abilities. For example, Jean Grimshaw pointed out that having children, which is meaningful for a lot of people, can also be a source of pain, struggle, and even oppression for others. And the idea that women are naturally more peaceful or environmentally conscious, that doesn't really hold up when you consider how women participate in all aspects of society, including things like the military and industries that harm the environment. Beauvoir's earlier point about how experience is shaped by social and historical context was still really important here.
And then we have the psychoanalytic side of sexual difference theory, especially the work of Luce Irigaray. Her ideas seem pretty different from the radical feminist focus on celebrating biological stuff.
Yeah, Irigaray did this really in-depth critique of what she saw as bias towards men in Western philosophy and psychoanalysis. She argued that man had always been presented as the standard, the universal human subject, and this basically made women invisible, or reduced them to this narrow category of motherhood. She insisted that sexual difference wasn't just a social thing, it was something that shaped how we think, how we use language, even our very being. One of her big ideas was that the physical shape of our bodies is reflected in our mental processes. She compared Western rationality, which is all about clear-cut categories and boundaries, to a more fluid, ambiguous, feminine way of thinking and being. And she linked this to female anatomy, using the metaphor of lips to suggest this constant connection, like how the contact of at least two lips keeps a woman in touch with herself.
That idea of a specifically feminine way of thinking linked to the female body, that's been interpreted in a lot of different ways. It also raises questions about essentialism. Like, was she saying that biology determines how women think?
That's a common misunderstanding of Irigaray's work. She was very clear that we can't access the body outside of how it's represented in culture. She wasn't focused on some pre-social, purely biological body. She was more interested in how male and female bodies are imagined and experienced within Western culture. As Margaret Whitford has argued, her project was about creatively reimagining the female body, helping women to think and feel about their bodies in new ways, not about defining some essential female nature. But even with this emphasis on reimagination, she still seemed to hold on to this idea that there are fundamentally two types of sexed bodies that shape our imaginations.
And other thinkers like Battersby, Cavallero, and Stone have picked up on this idea of reimagining the female or maternal body as a starting point for philosophy. They're looking at how this changes our understanding of big concepts like identity and subjectivity.
Exactly. Thinkers like Christine Battersby explore how our whole understanding of identity shifts if we start with the female subject as the norm. She focuses on natality, the fact that we're all born from a woman's body. Adriana Cavallero criticizes Western philosophy for being obsessed with death and ignoring our maternal origins, arguing that this is because we don't pay enough attention to our early dependence on the maternal body. And Alison Stone looks at the maternal body as a place where we can develop new models of subjectivity, ones that are based on intimacy and connection, rather than the traditional focus on autonomy and independence.
So, Van, from early feminism's suspicion of the body to attempts to celebrate female embodiment, and now to these more radical rethinkings of the relationship between body, thought, and being. But this focus on a binary of sexual difference also got some serious pushback,
Yeah.
right? And that's where intersectionality comes in.
Yes, intersectionality was a huge challenge to a lot of earlier feminist theories, especially those that mainly focused on sexual difference. Black feminist thinkers like Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, and Surma Bilge, along with people in disability studies and trans studies like Rosemary Garland Thompson, Talia Mae Betcher, and Emi Koyama, they all argued that gender doesn't exist in isolation. It's always intertwined with other social categories. They questioned whether it was even possible to come up with a single explanation of gendered embodiment that would apply to everyone.
Because, like, being a woman isn't the same experience for everyone, right? It's shaped by so many other things like race, class, sexuality, and ability.
Exactly. What it means to be a man or a woman, the opportunities and challenges that come with your gender, how those things are experienced in your body, All of that is influenced by how gender intersects with these other categories. For example, the experience of being a woman is totally different for a black woman compared to a white, cisgender, able-bodied woman, and so on, across all the different variations of human experience. The norms and expectations that come with those intersecting categories are often really different, although they can also overlap and reinforce each other in complicated ways.
And Audre Lorde's statement about always being pressured to pluck out some aspect of myself and present that to you as the meaningful whole, that really captures how messed up it is to ignore all those different parts of a person's identity. And like we talked about before, Sojourner Truth's speech is a great example of how the experience of being a black woman under slavery was completely different from the mainstream idea of womanhood, which was often based on the experiences of white middle-class women.
Absolutely. And Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality really highlights that racism and sexism aren't separate things that just get added on top of each other. They actually intersect and create unique experiences, especially for black women. It's not just about being black and a woman, it's about how the experience of being a woman is fundamentally shaped by being black in a society that's built on both racial and gender hierarchies. And similarly, disability theorists have shown how disability affects how gender is experienced and how gender affects the experience of disability. This challenges any attempt to come up with a universal definition of what it means to be male or female. Like the privileges that often come with traditional femininity, those are often denied to women with disabilities.
This really shows how complex embodied experience is and how any theory that tries to explain gender or embodiment with one simple explanation is going to fall short. Now, the Stanford entry then talks about bodily practices. This is about how we actually shape and control our bodies and the bodies of others. It seems like this is where social norms really have a direct impact on our physical selves.
Yeah, totally. Starting with Mary Wollstonecraft, feminist writers have paid attention to all the rules and norms that govern our bodies and how we often unconsciously regulate our own appearance and the appearance of others based on those norms. Beauvoir touched on these ideas, and then later thinkers like Susan Bordeaux really expanded on them. They've shown how our bodies are literally trained, shaped, and impressed with the dominant ideas of masculinity and femininity through all sorts of social and cultural practices.
Things like strict dieting, putting on makeup, working out, following fashion trends, even having cosmetic surgery. Those can all be seen as ways of trying to fit our bodies into these ideals of what men and women are supposed to look like. And it's not just about gender, right? These pressures also exist around things like race and ability.
For sure. Like, think about things like hair straightening treatments, using colored contact lenses to change your eye color, or having surgery to change racialized features. These are all examples of how people try to change their bodies to fit into these culturally privileged ideals. Things like whiteness, able-bodiedness, youthfulness, and specific standards of beauty. And Andrea Dworkin's observation that not one part of a woman's body is left untouched, unaltered, is just this stark reminder of how pervasive these pressures are.
And it's not just that these pressures are imposed on us from the outside, we also internalize them, often without even realizing it, and we participate in these practices ourselves. Sometimes it can even feel good or empowering to do these things. Michel Foucault's work on power and discipline has been really helpful for understanding how this works, especially when it comes to gender and the body.
Yeah, feminist scholars have used Foucault's ideas to show how these seemingly individual choices, like what we wear or whether we have surgery, are actually connected to these bigger systems of power and meaning. They communicate things about our social status and how we want to be seen. But post-structuralist thinkers also point out that these practices can have multiple, even contradictory meanings. So there are debates within feminism about what things like wearing makeup or having cosmetic surgery really mean. Susan Bordeaux's work on anorexia is a good example of this complexity. She shows how trying to be thin can be about feeling powerless and trying to gain control at the same time, depending on the person and the situation.
So this idea of actively shaping our bodies leads to Judith Butler's concept of performativity, which takes us even further. She's saying that these normalizing practices aren't just controlling our bodies, they're actually how sex subjects are created in the first place. That's a pretty radical idea.
It definitely is. Butler, building on Beauvoir's idea of becoming a woman, argues that gender differences and the assumption of heterosexuality aren't based on some natural foundation. Instead, they're actively produced and reinforced through all these performances, all the actions and rituals and ways of talking that make it seem like these categories are just natural and already exist. Like, think about when a baby is born and the doctor says it's a girl. Butler argues that this isn't just a neutral statement of fact, it's a speech act that helps to make that baby into a girl within a particular social context.
So for Butler, gender isn't something you have, it's something you do, and something that's done to you through all these social scripts and expectations. And people who don't fit into those narrow definitions of gender, they face all sorts of consequences. They become, in her words, the abject.
Right. These performances of gender happen all the time in all sorts of situations, and they're always connected to other aspects of who we are, like race, class, and ability. And they often follow these unspoken scripts that tell us how to act, scripts that set up these impossible ideals. And this ends up reinforcing the power of the dominant groups, men and heterosexual people. And people who don't perform their gender according to those norms, they get marginalized, stigmatized, punished, excluded.
And if gender is really just a performance, then the connection between biological sex and gender identity becomes less fixed and inevitable. It opens up new ways of understanding same-sex relationships and transgender experiences, which were often seen as abnormal or wrong in those older theories of sexual difference. The trans community especially challenges these rigid ideas about gender.
Exactly. Butler sees same-sex practices and transgender performances as ways of breaking down those norms that link gender to heterosexuality and that say your gender has to match the sex you were assigned at birth. Like, the documentary Pregnant Man, which follows a transgender man through his pregnancy, is a great example of how those seemingly fixed categories can be challenged and changed. But even Butler admits that you can't always predict or control how these performances will be interpreted. And it can be really hard to figure out how much agency we have within all these deeply ingrained social scripts.
So Butler's theory of performativity, especially as she laid it out in Gender Trouble, got a lot of criticism. People questioned whether it accounted for the material reality of the body. How did she respond to that?
In the preface to her later book, Bodies That Matter, she directly addresses that criticism about materiality. People felt like her theory didn't account for the fact that our bodies are real, that we eat and sleep and feel pain and pleasure. And her response was to develop this idea of materialization. She argues that even our understanding of what matter is shaped by concepts and ideas, which are always influenced by power and social norms.
So this idea that there's this fixed biological sex that exists before society gets involved, she's saying that's actually an effect of how we define and categorize things. That's a pretty subtle point.
It is. And building on the work of Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Butler suggests that we can't think about the body in some pure objective way that's separate from how we understand it. We always encounter the body through language and culture, through different ways of thinking about it and assigning meaning to it. For Butler, matter isn't this static thing. It's an ongoing process that creates the illusion of being fixed and unchanging. She argues that even though we can't fully capture the body with language, the only way to explore different understandings of it is through those very discursive possibilities.
But this focus on discourse led to more criticism, with some people saying that it still didn't give enough weight to the body itself, its ability to resist being defined by language. This idea of giving more agency to material reality seems to be a big part of what's driving new materialism in feminist thought.
You got it. Thinkers like Stacey Alamo and Susan Heckman, working within new materialism, argued that while Butler's focus on discourse was valuable, it maybe neglected the reality of material bodies and how those bodies change and are changed by the world. They emphasized that language shapes how we understand what's real, but it doesn't create reality itself. A big part of new materialism is this idea that matter isn't passive or inert. It actually plays a role in shaping meaning and discourse.
Like Elizabeth Grouse, for example, she felt like the focus on mattering had overshadowed matter itself in Butler's work, and she wanted to bring back the importance of materiality, seeing the body as constantly becoming, something that goes beyond any cultural or linguistic explanation.
Yeah, Gross saw nature not as something fixed, but as a space of possibility, where the body is always changing and transforming. She often looked to biology, even Darwinian evolution, to understand the potential within biological existence that culture and history can work with and transform. But some of her conclusions, like the idea that natural selection explains certain human characteristics, or that a binary understanding of sex is somehow fundamental to reality, those have been criticized by feminist biologists for maybe bringing back essentialist thinking, even if she didn't mean to.
And that brings up this really important tension.
Yeah.
How do we acknowledge biology and materiality without falling back into biological determinism or that simplistic binary model of sex? The work of feminist biologists like Anne Fausto Sterling and Nellie Outshorn has been crucial in challenging that binary and showing how our understanding of sex differences is shaped by culture and assumptions.
Absolutely. Fausto Sterling's work on intersex bodies and Algehorn's research on the history of how we understand sex hormones, they've shown how limited and socially constructed the binary model of sex is, and how cultural ideas about gender have shaped scientific research itself. And trans theorists like Ricky Ann Wilchins and, later, Lane have argued that a deeper understanding of biology actually supports the idea of a spectrum of sex and gender, not just two categories. The big takeaway here is that we can't separate the biological aspects of our bodies from how we understand and experience them.
And this leads to thinkers like Karen Barad with her idea of the entanglement of matter and meaning, and Donna Haraway with her Cyborg Manifesto. They're both trying to move past that traditional separation between nature and culture in their analyses of embodiment.
Right. Barat's concept of agential realism says that discourse and materiality are always shaping each other, and that matter itself is an active force in the world, not just something that gets meaning imposed on it. And Haraway, even before Butler's gender trouble, was trying to break down that nature-culture divide with her concept of nature culture. She argued that they're inseparable. Her idea of the cyborg, this mix of human, animal, and machine, is a symbol of resisting any attempt to base our existence on some pure, essential nature. She famously described cyborg as a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. And she saw nature as this active force, a partner in the pertinent conversation of how we come to understand the world. She wanted us to have a more respectful relationship with the material world, one that goes beyond just using it for our own purposes.
It's so interesting how all these different perspectives, new materialism, cyborg theory, are all dealing with this complicated relationship between our bodies and the social and cultural forces that shape them. Now, the Stanford entry also mentions pragmatism. How does that philosophical tradition fit into feminist perspectives on the body?
Feminist pragmatism offers a really interesting way to rethink those old divides between nature and culture, the material, and the discursive. It draws on the work of American pragmatists like John Dewey, William James, and Jane Addams, their ideas about a naturalist ontology, about focusing on solving social problems, and about the idea that our knowledge is always changing those things, all connect to feminist concerns about the body. For example, Shannon Sullivan uses Dewey's concept of the habituated organism to address what she sees as a lack of attention to the actual experience of living in a body in some post-structuralist theories, including Butler's earlier work.
And Dewey's rejection of those traditional dualisms, especially the mind-body split, seems really important in this pragmatic approach. Feminist pragmatists use that to reframe how we think about nature and culture, self and other, emphasizing that we're always interacting with our environment.
Exactly. Sullivan uses Dewey's ideas of transaction, which is about how we're connected to our environment, body-mind, which rejects the idea that our mental and physical processes are separate, and habit, which is about the patterned ways our bodies work and adapt. And then she brings in Butler's performativity, trying to create a framework that acknowledges both the role of language and the importance of our lived bodily experience, which is always shaped by things like gender and race. Like new materialists, pragmatists see nature and matter as active forces. Sullivan, in her work on the physiology of oppression, looks at how our bodies and our habits interact with our social and material environment. She argues that in a sexist and racist world, our biology can actually be shaped by experiences of oppression.
Wow, so our biology is actually affected by social inequalities. That's a powerful idea. And the connections to new materialism through Dewey's interest in Darwin, plus the pragmatist emphasis on experience over abstract theory, those seem to offer another way to understand the relationship between the material and the discursive in how we think about gender and the body.
Exactly. It's another lens to view all these complex interactions.
And finally, the Stanford entry talks about a renewed interest in feminist phenomenology. We started with Beauvoir's phenomenological approach, but it seems like this tradition has made a comeback in recent decades, especially when it comes to understanding lived bodily experience.
It has. After early work by people like Sandra Lee Bartkey and Iris Marion Young in the late 70s, there was a resurgence of feminist phenomenology in the 90s and 2000s, with scholars like Linda Martin Alcoff, Sarah Heinema, and Gail Weiss really contributing to the field. And like pragmatism, this approach really focuses on the experience of living in a body as our primary way of being in the world. This is different from post-structuralism, which is sometimes suspicious of the idea of experience because it can seem like it's assuming there's this pure, unmediated experience that's not shaped by anything. Instead, contemporary phenomenology looks at bodies in specific situations where what's natural and what's social are always mixed up, like the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty said.
And this return.